It's strange how some films arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, and yet leave behind a trail of questions that never truly fades. The Hidden was one of those films, a furious blend of body horror, cosmic dread, and Reagan-era paranoia wrapped in the shell of an action thriller. But beneath the explosions, the shootouts, and the strangely cheerful psychopaths tearing through Los Angeles, there was always something else pulsing underneath. Something colder, something that felt a little too real. Maybe it's because the film never treated its alien parasite as a metaphor. It treated it like a truth, an invisible force that could slip into anyone, turn a stranger into a killer, and keep moving as if nothing mattered. Audiences walked out entertained, but a select few walked out unsettled, whispering that the film felt like a warning disguised as pulp science fiction. Behind its cult reputation lies a maze of odd decisions, backstage conflicts, improvised dangers, scenes that were almost banned, and a casting choice that changed the tone of the entire story. The production was faster than it should have been, rougher than the studio wanted, and stranger than anyone expected. Some of what happened behind the camera was never meant to be known. Some of it reshaped the film in ways that even the director couldn't fully control, and some of it, depending on who you believe, had nothing to do with filmmaking at all. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. The Hidden 1987. Fact 1. The studio didn't want a horror film, but they got one anyway. The first strange truth behind The Hidden is that the studio never intended to make anything resembling a horror movie. Their initial pitch was simple, a fast, stylish police thriller with a science fiction twist, nothing too dark, nothing too philosophical, and certainly nothing that would risk an rating. Yet the moment the alien parasite made its way into the script, the film began to mutate into something far more unsettling. Even the earliest drafts described the creature not as an entity, but as a hunger, an invasive force that amplified the worst impulses of its host. Executives pushed back immediately. They wanted car chases, bullets, and soundtrack-friendly mayhem. What they got instead was a story about identity collapse, bodily violation, and the terror of losing control from the inside out. The director insisted that the alien host transfer sequence remain grotesque, a moment that felt sticky, primal, and wrong. Studio notes begged for something cleaner, less organic, less psychological, but the team held their ground, arguing that the horror wasn't the parasite itself. It was the idea of a killer who could be anyone, wearing a human body like a borrowed coat. In the end, the executives relented, though not before threatening to cut funding entirely. Ironically, the very elements they tried to remove became the film's defining tone. Viewers weren't shaken by the shootouts. They were shaken by the quiet moments, the lingering stare of a possessed host, the puppet-like stiffness of someone no longer fully themselves, and the unnerving suggestion that evil doesn't need motives when it can simply move to a better body. And decades later, when critics re-evaluated the film, they never mentioned the studio's original plan. They only talked about the horror. The one thing the producers spent months trying to avoid became the one thing audiences could never forget. Fact 2. Kyle MacLachlan's performance wasn't acting the way you think. Kyle MacLachlan's strange, almost porcelain-like performance has long been a topic of debate, but few people know that his portrayal of Lloyd Gallagher wasn't crafted through traditional acting methods. From day one, MacLachlan insisted he didn't want Gallagher to behave like a typical cop or even a typical alien masquerading as a human. He wanted him to feel displaced, not awkward, not robotic, but slightly misaligned, as if he were borrowing human behavior rather than naturally inhabiting it. To achieve this, he built a rulebook for himself. No contractions in speech unless emotionally forced, minimal blinking in scenes of stress, and physical stillness whenever other characters were moving. The idea was to create friction, a sense that Gallagher didn't fully understand how to blend into the rhythm of human life. On set, this made some crew members uneasy. They described him as present but drifting, a man who seemed to listen a half-second too late and react a half-second too early. It was subtle, unnerving, and completely intentional. The studio worried he was too weird, arguing that audiences wouldn't connect with him, but the director defended the choice fiercely. Gallagher wasn't supposed to be approachable. He was supposed to be a mirror, a calm, alien counterpoint to the chaotic violence erupting across Los Angeles. And because MacLachlan refused to exaggerate the otherworldliness, his character became far more haunting. He wasn't an alien painted in cliches. He was a consciousness struggling to remain inside a body that didn't quite fit. Years later, MacLachlan admitted that the performance exhausted him, not because of the emotional demands, but because pretending to be human is harder than it looks. Critics still debate what made his character so memorable, but the truth is simple. He wasn't playing an alien disguised as a man. He was playing a man who had forgotten how to be human and was desperately trying to remember. Fact 3. The film's opening scene was practically an accident. The unforgettable opening, the security footage, the silent menace, the explosion of violence feels meticulously planned. But behind the scenes, it was nearly a disaster built from miscommunication, budget constraints, and a last-minute rewrite scribbled on the back of a props invoice. Originally, the film was meant to open with a slow, atmospheric sequence showing the parasite's arrival on Earth. A meteor streak, a crash site, a sense of cosmic dread. But the studio deemed it too expensive and too slow for an action-forward release. Backed into a corner, the director was forced to rethink everything overnight. The breakthrough came when he realized the alien wasn't the real horror the human shell was. So he pitched a bold change. Open on a man committing violent, unmotivated chaos, filmed from security cameras, letting the audience experience the creature's presence long before seeing it. But the problem was that they didn't have the crew, the lighting, or even the permits for a large-scale shoot on such short notice. So they improvised. The security camera footage was shot using low-grade equipment borrowed from a closed department store. The lobby shootout was filmed with only half the planned stunt team because several performers were stuck in traffic. Even the explosion that punctuates the scene wasn't supposed to happen that day. It was triggered early when a power relay overloaded. The crew panicked until they replayed the footage. The accidental blast looked perfect, raw, ugly, real. To everyone's surprise, the hurried scene became the most iconic part of the film. Critics praised its documentary-like energy, its cold detachment, its refusal to offer explanation or comfort. What began as a constraint became the defining aesthetic of The Hidden, a world where violence erupts without reason, surveillance captures everything, and the real monster might not be the alien at all, but the human body it chooses to wear. Fact 4. The alien was never meant to be seen this way. One of the strangest secrets behind The Hidden is that the alien parasite's final on-screen form was never meant to look the way it does. Early concept art painted a very different creature, long, needle-like, almost insectoid, a shape that communicated stealth rather than brute force. But the problem began when the effects team realized the design couldn't move believably under 1,987's limited budget. The puppet mechanics kept locking, the fibers tore too easily, and the most horrifying version of the creature simply refused to cooperate. Sooner or later, they had to admit the uncomfortable truth. The terrifying alien they had been designing for months wasn't going to work. The director pushed for a compromise, one that eventually became iconic, a slug-like organism with a glossy, muscle-wet sheen, something less elegant but more biological. Studio executives hated it, calling it too grotesque, but the effects team insisted that its ugliness was the point. It wasn't an alien engineered for beauty or menace. It was a parasite, a thing designed by nature to slip, burrow, and infect. The problem was that no one had anticipated how much the cameras would magnify every slimy detail. The creature's infamous transfer scene became a battlefield behind the camera. The team struggled to keep the prosthetic lubricated enough to look alive, while also preventing it from sliding off the prop body prematurely. It took 19 takes to capture the final shot, not because the puppet malfunctioned, but because actors and crew kept gagging audibly off-screen, ruining the audio. One assistant reportedly quit after the second day of shooting those scenes, claiming the smell of the gel mixture felt biological. The irony is that the creature's crude, visceral appearance, born out of failure, panic, and last-minute reinvention, was precisely what made audiences remember it. The alien was no sleek invader from space. It was a wet, writhing embodiment of corruption, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones engineered with perfection, but the ones that look like they were never meant to be seen at all. Fact 5. The sound designer created the alien's voice from a human organ. While audiences often praise the film for its action and creature effects, they rarely realize how much of its horror comes from sound, specifically the alien's unsettling, almost wet vocalizations. What few people know is that the sound designer didn't use electronics, synthesizers, or animal recordings for those noises. He used the human body. More precisely, a slowed, processed, and layered recording of a medical suction device pulling air through a human cadaver's trachea during an anatomy lab demonstration he attended years before the film. He had kept the tape not out of morbid fascination, but because the texture was unlike anything he had ever heard. It didn't sound alive, but it didn't sound mechanical either. It was a liminal noise, neither breath nor voice, a hollow, collapsing rasp that seemed to come from something struggling to imitate life. When he presented the idea to the producers, they were horrified and immediately rejected it as too disturbing, insisting he fabricate something using more conventional methods. But he continued experimenting in secret. Eventually, he created a hybrid. The cadaver recording mixed with the friction of rubber gloves stretched to their breaking point, blended with the rhythmic pulse of a malfunctioning aquarium pump. When he played the final composite for the director, the room fell silent. It sounded organic but wrong, like a vocal cord attempting to communicate without fully understanding language. The director approved it on the spot, but warned the designer never to reveal its origins publicly. The studio only learned the truth after the film's release. When an interviewer asked about the creature's voice and the designer casually described the process, they were furious, but it was too late. Critics had already praised the sound as uniquely biological, a tone that seemed to crawl across the spine. And that's the strange power of the decision. The alien in the hidden doesn't just look invasive, it sounds like something that was never meant to speak and only recently learned how. Fact: Shesht. The car chases were so dangerous, the crew hid the footage. The film's frantic car chases are often cited as some of the most adrenaline-fueled sequences of the 1,980 seconds, but the truth behind them is far more chaotic than the final edit suggests. The production didn't have the budget for a full stunt unit, nor the time to follow every safety guideline. As a result, many of the chase scenes were effectively guerrilla filmmaking disguised as studio-approved action. Entire blocks of Los Angeles were used without proper permits, forcing the crew to shoot fast, pray for luck, and run before law enforcement arrived. Several of the biggest stunts were captured under circumstances bordering on reckless. One scene involving a car plowing through an outdoor cafe set was performed with only partial street control, meaning there were real pedestrians nearby who had not been fully briefed. A stunt driver later admitted that a single miscalculation of 2 feet would have resulted in casualties. Another moment, the high-speed corner drift captured from a low ground angle was so dangerous that the camera operator refused to stand in position. They mounted the camera to a sandbag instead, leaving it unattended as cars howled past inches away. After each shoot, the crew privately reviewed the footage. Some shots were so close to disaster that they agreed never to mention the conditions under which they were filmed. They stored the tapes separately to avoid studio scrutiny. Ironically, the very footage they feared would get them shut down became the material that made the film's action scenes feel gritty, immediate, and frighteningly real. Nothing was smooth. Nothing was safe. Everything vibrated with the sense that the world was seconds away from going catastrophically wrong. Audiences assumed the intensity was intentional. The studio praised the realism. But the truth is far stranger. The hidden didn't achieve its kinetic energy through careful design. It captured it through the literal risk of collapse, a production running just fast enough to stay ahead of its own consequences. Fact: Shiva, the possessed performances were built from real medical cases. One of the eeriest qualities of the hidden is the way each possessed host moves. Stiff, jittering, strangely animalistic in one moment and eerily calm in the next. Viewers often assumed the actors simply improvised strange tics or exaggerated body language for effect. But the truth is far more methodical. The director brought in a neurologist from UCLA to brief the cast on real-world disorders involving involuntary movement, dissociative behavior, and identity fragmentation. The goal wasn't to mimic pathology, but to study how the human body behaves when consciousness is disrupted, when something else is in control. The neurologist showed archival footage of patients with temporal lobe seizures, split brain conditions, and certain rare parasitic infections affecting the nervous system. Some actors found the material disturbing enough to leave the room. Others took notes obsessively, shaping their performances around specific symptoms: delayed motor response, sudden rigidity, microspasms, and a particular blankness of gaze that occurs when the brain's emotional centers detach from action. This scientific approach gave the film's horror an uncomfortable realism. Instead of portraying the alien as a cartoonish invader, the actors grounded their movement in patterns the human body really exhibits under neurological distress. The result was a kind of authentic uncanny, a performance style that felt plausible even when the plot veered into cosmic territory. One actor later admitted that the hardest part wasn't the physical work, but the mental reset afterward. "If you study dissociation long enough," he said, "you start to feel it creeping into your own habits." He wasn't the only one. A crew member claimed that during a late-night shoot, one performer stayed in a frozen, trance-like posture even after the director yelled "cut," unresponsive, for nearly a minute before snapping out of it. Whether exhaustion, method acting, or something stranger was responsible remains unclear. The key takeaway is this: the possessed hosts in The Hidden weren't monsters. They were human bodies, behaving as if something had quietly rewired their instincts, because, in a way, something had. Fact 8. The FBI agent subplot was nearly cut after a real agent complained. The film's depiction of a secretive federal division chasing an extraterrestrial parasite might seem like standard sci-fi embellishment, but behind the scenes, it struck an unexpected nerve. Midway through production, a real FBI agent, who had ties to a technical advisor on another movie filming nearby, heard about the plot's federal involvement and took issue with the script's portrayal. Specifically, he argued that certain phrases used in the dialogue resembled actual internal terminology not meant for public use. No one on the production had any idea what he was talking about. The screenwriter insisted the terminology was invented, the product of late-night rewrites and caffeine. But the agent stood firm. Some of the lines echoed real operational slang. Whether this was coincidence, paranoia, or something else entirely is still debated among the crew. What matters is that the complaint caused a small panic within the studio. Executives considered cutting the subplot entirely. They feared potential government scrutiny, negative press, or even accidental exposure of procedures they didn't know they were referencing. The director fought back, arguing that the entire narrative structure hinged on the uneasy dance between local police and a broader, shadowy authority. Without the federal thread, the story would collapse into a generic chase film. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Minor dialogue adjustments and the removal of one specific line that supposedly came too close to a real federal classification. That line has never been publicly identified, but one former crew member claims it described a protocol for tracking non-conforming biological entities, a phrase the writer swears he made up at 2 in the morning. The strangest part? After the film's release, a letter arrived from an anonymous sender praising the movie's accuracy in spirit. Whether it was a fan, a prank, or something more official remains an open question, but it certainly made the filmmakers wonder how much of their fiction had been accidental truth. Fact 9. The dog scene was more dangerous than anyone knew. One of the most unsettling moments in The Hidden is the brief but chilling sequence involving a dog staring with unnatural intensity, a moment that suggests the alien parasite has jumped into an innocent host. The scene lasts only seconds, but shooting it was far more complicated than expected. The production used a trained dog, but even the best trained animals have limits, especially when asked to perform eerie stillness on command. The trainer prepared the dog for weeks, teaching it to hold a fixed gaze without reacting to movement or noise around it. But the real danger wasn't the dog disobeying it, was the environment. The scene required a dimly lit set filled with electrical equipment, cables, and props coated with synthetic slime. Animals, even trained ones, don't always navigate such hazards well. During the second take, the dog slipped on a slick patch of liquid from a previous effects shot and nearly collided with a high-voltage lighting rig. The crew froze. The trainer sprinted forward. A stunt coordinator dove to shield the equipment. The dog was unharmed, but the incident forced the team to rethink the setup. They reduced lighting intensity, cleared cables out of frame, and slowed shooting to ensure the animal never faced the same risk again. Ironically, these adjustments made the final shot even creepier. The darker lighting deepened the shadows around the dog's eyes, making its stare appear colder and more intelligent, almost calculating. The real challenge came afterward. The dog began behaving strangely between takes, pacing in tight circles and refusing treats. The trainer insisted it was overstimulation from the set environment, not fear. But several crew members whispered that the dog seemed to be watching them, as if its performance hadn't fully ended. One camera operator said he caught the animal staring directly into the lens long after the scene was over, holding eye contact with unnerving steadiness. In the final edit, the dog appears for less than a minute. But for those on set, that minute came from hours of tension, near accidents, and a lingering sense that some animals don't need direction to act possessed, they just need the right moment. Fact 10. The music score was built from wrong notes on purpose. Most audiences remember The Hidden for its chaos, its violence, and its extraterrestrial dread, but beneath all of that lurks something subtler, a soundscape that feels constantly off balance. What many don't know is that the composer didn't build the score on traditional harmonic rules. Instead, he created it from mistakes. His philosophy was simple: if the alien parasite doesn't belong in this world, then the music shouldn't either. So he constructed the soundtrack around intervals that classically trained musicians are taught to avoid: tritones, unresolved sevenths, and abrupt key shifts that never settle into a comfortable pattern. He recorded instruments being played incorrectly, guitars tuned microtonally out of sync, violins bowed at the wrong angles, percussive hits delayed by fractions of a second. The goal wasn't chaos, but dislocated rhythm, a feeling that something was slightly wrong even when the scene looked normal. The result was a score that operates almost subliminally. Viewers didn't consciously hear the discord, they felt it. One of the strangest sessions involved a malfunctioning synthesizer whose internal clock drifted unpredictably. Instead of fixing it, the composer sampled the drifting pitch and layered it underneath several tracks. When paired with the alien's screeching vocalizations, it produced a sensation that critics later described as the oral equivalent of a migraine caught in slow motion. The studio hated the effect, insisting audiences would think the audio was defective, but the director refused to remove it. The brilliance of the score is that it mirrors the film's thematic spine. Just as the alien invader hijacks the human body without fully understanding it, the music hijacks familiar instruments without obeying musical logic. It creeps under the viewer's skin, tugging at a primal discomfort that has nothing to do with the visuals on screen. And the strangest irony, when the movie gained its cult following years later, many fans praised the soundtrack as ahead of its time. They had no idea that the music's haunting power came from the simple decision to break every rule and then make the broken pieces sing. Fact 11. The crew discovered an unintentional Easter egg after filming. Unlike modern productions that plant secrets deliberately, The Hidden wasn't built with Easter eggs in mind. But one cryptic detail slipped through the cracks unnoticed by the cast, crew, and director until years after release. During a sequence in which the alien host wanders through a crowded street, the camera pans past a store window reflecting the chaos behind it. In that reflection, for a split second, a figure appears who does not belong to the scene, a pale man in a black suit, standing perfectly still, watching the action with an unreadable expression. He's not part of the cast. He's not an extra. He's not a passerby. In the production logs, no one is listed for that position. When frame-by-frame analysis surfaced on early internet forums decades later, the crew became aware of the anomaly. At first, they assumed it was a lighting technician or a crew member inadvertently caught on camera, but the shot was captured from a low crane, an angle that no crew member should have been standing in, especially not in the exact alignment needed to appear in that reflection. The director reviewed the old raw footage and confirmed something even stranger. In additional takes, the man appears again, same spot, same posture, same blank face. And then, in one take, he's suddenly gone, not walking away, not leaving the frame, simply not present when he should have been visible based on the previous camera angles. Most of the crew chalked it up to coincidence, an illusion created by overlapping reflections. But one camera operator disagreed. He claimed the figure wasn't a person at all, but an artifact created by the reflective surfaces interacting with each other. A ghost made of geometry, he called it. Whether that was a poetic explanation or an attempt to avoid uncomfortable questions remains unclear. Regardless of the truth, the anomaly became one of the film's unintentional legends, a reminder that sometimes the creepiest Easter eggs are the ones no one intended to hide. Fact 12. The director tested audience fear responses in secret screenings. Most test screenings are routine. Studios gauge pacing, audience confusion, or comedic timing. But The Hidden's director had a different agenda. He wanted to measure fear not through surveys or verbal feedback, but through involuntary physical reactions. Inspired by psychological research on autonomic stress responses, he arranged a series of secret test screenings where select viewers were unknowingly monitored for heart rate spikes, muscle tension, and micro-expressions during key scenes. The experiment was simple but ethically dubious. Cameras positioned behind the audience captured subtle flinches. Sensors hidden in the armrests measured sudden grip strength. Even the theater's air conditioning system was adjusted to maintain a slightly colder temperature, heightening physiological sensitivity. The director wasn't looking for jump scares, he was mapping emotional resonance, how long discomfort lingered after a scene, where tension built naturally, and which character interactions triggered subconscious unease. The results surprised him. The alien transfer scenes produced predictable spikes, but the highest physiological stress didn't occur during violence at all. It occurred during prolonged stillness moments where a possessed host stood unnaturally quiet, staring without blinking, processing the world with a gaze that didn't quite belong to the body it inhabited. The director realized that stillness, not action, was the film's true engine of fear. That discovery led to several late-stage edits emphasizing lingering shots, slow zooms, and the quiet menace of a host who seemed to be listening to something the audience couldn't hear. Studio executives were never told about the experiment, and the footage from those screenings has never surfaced. Whether it was destroyed or simply misplaced remains unknown. But those who attended the sessions reported an odd sensation afterward. Not fear, exactly, but a strange heaviness, as though the film had watched them back. And perhaps, in a way, it had. Fact 13. The body count was reduced after a psychologist warned the studio. Originally, The Hidden had a much higher body count. Early drafts depicted the alien parasite moving through hosts so rapidly that bodies piled up across the city, a grim montage meant to emphasize the organism's total disregard for human life. But during pre-production, the script underwent an unusual review. A clinical psychologist hired by the studio to evaluate potential audience impact. His concern wasn't moral panic or graphic violence, it was something more subtle: desensitization. According to his report, rapid, consequence-free, death-numbed viewers, reducing their emotional engagement and weakening the film's suspense. The alien would seem powerful, yes, but also cartoonish, stripping the story of tension. Horror, he argued, didn't come from frequency of violence, but from the anticipation of something inevitable but delayed. The director took the warning seriously. As a result, several scenes featuring additional kills were removed or rewritten. One sequence involving the alien transferring between two strangers on a crowded bus, a moment that would have required multiple stunt performers, was scrapped entirely. Another set piece, where a police precinct turns into a massacre zone, was reimagined into the more contained and tense confrontation that appears in the final film. Ironically, this reduction made the parasite feel more unnervingly deliberate. Its choices suddenly mattered. The hosts it selected seemed strategically or emotionally charged rather than random. Instead of mowing down people indiscriminately, the alien now appeared to study its environment, almost savoring the human forms it inhabited. The psychologist later admitted he was surprised the director followed the recommendation, but the change altered the film's psychological rhythm. Fewer deaths meant deeper dread, and deeper dread meant more investment. By limiting the body count, The Hidden became less of a slaughterhouse and more of a slow, invasive nightmare, the kind that lingers long after the screen fades to black. Fact 14. A lost subplot hinted that the alien wasn't the only visitor. Few fans know that The Hidden once included a substantial subplot suggesting that the parasite wasn't alone, that another extraterrestrial presence had arrived long before the events of the film. This concept never made it past early shooting, but traces of it remain buried in production notes and unfinished scenes. According to the original outline, a series of murders were supposed to feature inexplicable forensic anomalies, burns with no heat source, fingerprints that shifted patterns, and victims whose blood exhibited unusual metallic content. These clues were intended to imply a second entity whose motives differed entirely from the parasite's. The twist would reveal that Gallagher's otherworldly nature wasn't just a backstory but a clue. He was tracking a separate cosmic threat that had already begun shaping human history in subtle ways. The parasite was violent, chaotic, and obvious. The other entity was methodical, infiltrating institutions, influencing decisions, and using humans not as shells but as collaborators. The contrast would have pushed the narrative into darker, more conspiratorial territory. Why was it cut? The studio feared the plot would overcomplicate the story and confuse audiences expecting a straightforward action sci-fi hybrid. They demanded the script be streamlined, so the parasite remained the sole antagonist. Scenes referencing the second entity were removed, though one piece of dialogue, a cryptic line from Gallagher about others who came before, slipped into an early cut and reportedly survived long enough for test audiences to hear it. One editor later claimed that the excised subplot fundamentally changed the film's tone, from cosmic intrigue to kinetic horror, but the idea never fully died. Fans who scrutinize the movie frame by frame point to quiet oddities, symbols on walls, brief camera glances, unexplained cuts, and argue that the ghost of the abandoned concept still lingers in the margins. Whether intentional or accidental, those fragments give the hidden and unspoken suggestion: the alien parasite might not be the only thing hiding on Earth. Fact 15. The child actor's scene was cut because it felt too real. One of the most controversial decisions during editing involved a scene featuring a young child who briefly encounters a newly possessed host. The original sequence portrayed the parasite-inhabited adult wandering through a neighborhood playground, stopping to observe children with an expression of eerie fascination. The moment wasn't violent, but it was suffocatingly tense. The alien didn't understand childhood, innocence, or vulnerability. It simply watched, studying human social behavior with a cold, animalistic curiosity. The scene was meant to underline the parasite's inhuman detachment, but something unexpected happened on set. The child actor, unaware of the full context, reacted more naturally and more fearfully than the director anticipated. When the possessed host slowly approached, the child stepped back with genuine confusion and dread. It wasn't acting, it was instinct. The adults recognized the authenticity immediately. Some found it brilliant, others found it uncomfortable. During rough cut screenings, this short moment provoked an unusually strong reaction. Audiences didn't gasp or scream, they froze. The tension felt invasive, crossing an invisible boundary that separated fictional fear from something more primal. A studio executive later described the scene as too real in the wrong ways, arguing it created an emotional rupture that derailed the film's momentum. Editors debated for days before ultimately removing the sequence. The director grudgingly agreed, noting that the moment overpowered the surrounding scenes, pulling the film into a darker psychological space than intended. The footage remains in the archive, reportedly intact, but locked away due to contractual protections for the child actor. What survives is a faint echo, a subtle discomfort whenever the parasite observes human behavior, as if the removed scene imprinted itself tonally even after being cut. Sometimes the most haunting moments are the ones audiences never get to see, the ones that feel too close to something we'd rather not confront. Fact 16. The alien transfer scene caused a medical emergency on set. The alien transfer sequence, the grotesque moment when the parasite spills from one host to another, is one of the most disturbing images in The Hidden. What audiences never saw is how close that scene came to causing an actual medical crisis during production. The practical effects required the parasite puppet to be surrounded by a mixture of glycerin, animal gelatin compounds, and tinted silicone designed to mimic a viscous, biological texture. When heated under studio lights, that mixture released a strong, metallic-smelling vapor. Most crew members found it unpleasant, but tolerable. One did not. During the third take, a special effects assistant working near the puppet suddenly collapsed. His breathing became shallow, and he displayed signs of acute respiratory distress. Filming stopped immediately as paramedics were called. The cause wasn't obvious at first. Heat exhaustion, an allergic reaction, chemical exposure. Later tests revealed that the assistant had a previously undiagnosed sensitivity to certain proteins present in the gelatin mixture. Under intense lighting, those proteins aerosolized, triggering a severe reaction the medical team described as dangerously close to anaphylaxis. The incident forced the crew to modify the effects setup. Ventilation systems were added. The mixture's composition was altered. Masks became mandatory in certain zones, but the scare left a psychological mark. Actors performing close to the puppet described an odd tension afterward, as if the creature had stopped being just an effect. One performer said that after witnessing the emergency, the transfer didn't feel like fiction anymore. It felt hostile. And Digester Hall. Ironically, the near disaster helped the scene artistically. The director later admitted that the fear in the actor's eyes during subsequent takes wasn't entirely performed. There was real apprehension, real caution, a real sense that something was off. That authenticity born from risk rather than rehearsal gave the final footage its unnerving immediacy. Sometimes horror on screen is crafted, sometimes it simply bleeds in from reality. Fact 17. The alien's movement was modeled after footage that no longer exists. One of the most unsettling aspects of the alien parasite is its motion. Not fluid, not rigid, but something in between, as if the creature were constantly adjusting to a world it didn't fully understand. Fans often credit puppetry or animatronics for the eerie realism, but the origins of the movement are stranger. The effects supervisor revealed years later that the team had studied a fragment of scientific footage from the early 1,970 seconds, showing an unidentified marine organism recorded during a deep-sea probe. The clip lasted only a few seconds, captured at low resolution, and supposedly featured a creature whose locomotion didn't resemble any known species. According to the supervisor, the organism moved in pulses, expanding and contracting, as if breathing through its entire body. It rotated without visible appendages, reacting to its environment in ways that seemed both purposeful and alien. The team found the footage by accident while researching parasitic invertebrates. To this day, no one can confirm its identity. The labeled origin was Anomaly 3B Archive, with no additional metadata. The effects team incorporated elements of this motion into the parasite puppet. They used flexible ribbing inside the body structure, forcing the puppeteers to manipulate it in rhythmic, wave-like contractions rather than typical linear movements. Heat lamps were used to soften the material, giving the creature a subtle sag and swell as it moved. The result was unnerving precisely because it was patterned after something real, something seen once and never cataloged again. When journalists later asked about the footage, the supervisor attempted to locate it in the university archives, but it was gone, not missing, not misfiled, but erased entirely from the master reel. Archivists couldn't explain the absence. Some suggested clerical error, others insisted the footage never existed in the first place. Regardless of the truth, the parasite's unsettling movement carries the faint echo of something observed in the deep decades earlier, a biological riddle stitched into a cinematic nightmare. Fact 18. A scene was cut because it implied the alien could remember previous hosts. One of the film's most intriguing concepts is that the alien parasite treats each host as a temporary vehicle, a vessel for impulse, violence, or escape. But an early version of the script hinted at something more profound. The creature might retain fragments of memory from each human it inhabited. This idea reached its peak in a deleted scene involving the alien occupying a dying man in a hospital bed. As the host's consciousness began to fade, the alien froze, seemingly overwhelmed by a cascade of disjointed recollections, childhood moments, family images, sensations of fear and regret. The scene was written to show the parasite reacting with something that resembled confusion or even grief, raising uncomfortable questions. Could a non-human entity absorb human emotion? Could it unintentionally inherit trauma or longing? And if so, did that mean the alien was evolving? The director filmed the sequence with haunting minimalism, long takes, quiet breathing, the alien's movements slowing as if caught between instinct and unfamiliar depth. When the studio reviewed the footage, they immediately objected. The implication that the creature could develop self-awareness or emotional complexity was deemed too philosophical for the film's intended tone. They feared audiences would sympathize with the alien or misinterpret it as a tragic figure instead of a threat. More importantly, adding emotional layering to the parasite risked derailing the narrative's pacing, pulling the story toward introspection rather than tension. The scene was removed from the final cut, though a few crew members maintained it was one of the most affecting moments of the entire production. One editor even suggested that the alien's later behavior, its hesitation in certain moments, its instinct to flee rather than fight, made more sense with this context. Without the cutscene, those moments remain eerie ambiguities. In the end, the question lingered: was the parasite simply a mindless force of appetite, or had it begun to glimpse the lives it was devouring? The film never answers. But the missing footage hints that the alien might have been haunted long before the audience ever was. Fact 19. A scene was altered after an actor refused to go blank. One recurring motif in The Hidden is the blankness that settles over a host's face moments after the alien takes control, a sudden draining of recognizable humanity. Most actors embraced this requirement, but one performer, who appeared in a major mid-film transfer scene, refused to play the moment as written. His reasoning was unexpected. He believed that true blankness wasn't emptiness, but resistance. His argument was that a human consciousness wouldn't simply vanish. It would claw at the edges of its own extinction, leaving behind micro-reactions, fear, confusion, anger flickering beneath the surface even as the alien overpowered the body. This interpretation clashed with the director's vision. He wanted a clean shift, a sharp drop into emotional vacancy that signaled a full takeover. They rehearsed it multiple ways, but the actor remained unconvinced. Off-camera, he studied footage of patients experiencing dissociative fugue states, drawing inspiration from how individuals sometimes seemed aware of their surroundings, yet disconnected from them. His approach was subtle, a tremor in the jaw, a tightening around the eyes, a last flicker of willpower. During filming, his performance created an unexpected tension. The alien's takeover didn't feel immediate. It felt contested, a battle no one could see but everyone could sense. When reviewing the footage, the director realized the actor's choice added an entirely new dimension to the film. Instead of portraying the parasite as a flawless puppeteer, it suggested the hosts weren't simply overwritten but forcibly suppressed. The takeover became more violent emotionally, even in silence. The studio initially objected, claiming the moment muddied the film's internal logic. But the director insisted it stayed, arguing that inconsistency was the point. Not all humans surrender equally. Some fight, even if only for a moment. The actor's interpretation reframed the parasite not as an omnipotent force, but as something that had to struggle, if only slightly, to maintain control. The final cut preserves that nuance. It's a tiny moment, easy to miss, but once noticed, it changes everything. Behind every blank stare might be a consciousness still screaming, unheard. Fact 20. The film's ending was rewritten after a test screening left viewers uneasy in the wrong way. The original ending of The Hidden was darker, stranger, and far more ambiguous than the version audiences ultimately saw. In the earliest cut, Gallagher's final act wasn't framed as a noble sacrifice, but as a moment of quiet, unsettling moral compromise. After transferring into Beck's dying body, the alien hunter didn't simply restore the officer to life. It became apparent that Beck's consciousness might not have survived the process at all. The last shot featured Beck's daughter approaching him hesitantly, sensing something off. The film would have ended on her uncertain expression as the camera lingered a beat too long, raising the possibility that a family had unknowingly welcomed a stranger into their lives. When this version was shown to a small test audience, the reaction was immediate and intense. It wasn't fear, or outrage, or even sadness. It was an emotional withdrawal. Viewers felt disturbed in a way that disconnected them from the narrative, rather than deepening its impact. Several described the ending as cruel without purpose. Others said it made the entire film feel nihilistic, undermining the bond formed between Beck and Gallagher. The studio demanded a rewrite. They wanted clarity, closure, and at least the illusion of hope. The director reluctantly agreed, crafting the more heroic version in which Gallagher's sacrifice feels restorative rather than parasitic. The new ending recast the alien not as an ambiguous survivalist, but as a being capable of empathy, a final gesture that softened the film's existential edge. But fragments of the original ending remain. The way Beck moves in the final scene, the slight stiffness of his posture, the hint of something watchful behind his eyes. Whether these are remnants of the initial performance or intentional echoes is still debated by fans. The truth is simple. The Hidden almost ended with a question too unsettling for 1,987 audiences, a question the final cut only half decides. When a consciousness enters a new body, does it bring salvation, or does it erase what was already there? Bonus fact, the final real disappearance that no one can explain. Long after The Hidden completed its theatrical run, a quiet rumor spread through post-production circles, the kind of rumor that only surfaces when a film becomes a cult object and people begin asking the right questions. According to several former crew members, one of the film's original working prints, a near-complete version containing alternate edits, temp score variations, and at least 2 fully finished scenes that never reached the public, vanished from the archive without a trace, not misplaced, not mislabeled, vanished. The missing reel wasn't just any reel. It contained an experimental assembly of the film's third act, crafted before the studio demanded clarity, hope, and narrative cohesion. This earlier version reportedly leaned heavily into the alien's perspective, not sympathetic, but observant, almost philosophical. Instead of treating violence as spectacle, the alien studied humans with a kind of cold anthropological curiosity. Some crew members described the footage as too quiet, too aware, and too unsettling for a wide release. When archivists conducted a routine inventory years later, they discovered that the canister labeled Reel 7B Alt was gone. The shelf space was empty. No checkout signature appeared in the logs. No transfer request existed. No internal memo explained its removal. It was as if the reel had never been stored at all. Most chalk it up to clerical error, a casualty of analog-era record-keeping. But a few people, including an assistant editor who handled the early negative, insist the canister was present for years before disappearing. He recalls the label vividly, a small red slash across the barcode, marking it as not for distribution. Another crew member believes the reel was deliberately pulled after a quiet internal discussion about tonal conflicts, but he never learned who initiated that discussion or why. To this day, no one knows what was on the missing reel or whether anyone outside the original post-production team ever saw it. The idea lingers like a faint echo. Somewhere in the film's history, an alternate vision existed, a version of the hidden that looked at humanity not with horror, but with a colder, more analytical gaze. And perhaps that's why it disappeared. Some stories aren't lost, they're removed. If you've made it this far, you already know the hidden is stranger, sharper, and far more deliberate than its cult reputation suggests. But the story behind the film is never truly finished. Somewhere between the lost reels, the altered endings, and the performances shaped by fear rather than fiction, there's still room for interpretation. Tell us in the comments which fact shifted your view of the film and which theory you think hides the real truth behind its creation. And if there's another title you want us to unearth next, leave your suggestion below. We'll follow the trail wherever it leads.